Wonderful. Okay, so we start with Maimonides, and Maimonides says, again, his book of laws is divided into 14 sections, 14 categories of law, and one is avodah, which means service, and meaning the service of the temple. And then in the section of the service of the temple, chapter 4, so the beginning, the first couple of chapters discuss at length how the temple was supposed to be built, etc. And then you get to chapter 4, which starts talking about the Holy of Holies and the Ark and what happened with the Ark. So here we go. The Ark was placed on a stone in the western portion of the Holy of Holies. The vial of manna and Aaron's staff were placed before it. So what's the vial of manna? So the verse says that when the manna was the miraculous food that fell during the desert, the verse says that God tells Moshe to take a jug of the manna and place it limishmeret as keeping, in other words, to guard it. And the idea was that the Jewish people should always have a symbol of this miracle. In addition to that, there's another thing that the Torah tells Moshe to keep limishmeret, and that's the staff of Aaron. Later on, we read in the Torah, in the fourth book of the Torah, that there was a rebellion by Korach, Moshe's cousin, and he questioned Aaron's appointment, and he said that Aaron was not really appointed by God, it was just Moshe giving the position to his brother, and there's the whole story how they were punished. But after they were punished, God tells Moshe that every tribe should give one staff, a stick, and Aaron should give a stick, and that's how God will show who he chooses. And miraculously, Aaron's staff blossomed and grew flowers. That's a story in flowers and almonds. That's the story in the Torah. And then God says, take the staff of Aaron, and it should be limishmeret as a guarding. So what Maimonides is telling us is that all these important items that God says we have to keep, where did we keep it? We kept it in the most important place, in the Holy of Holies. But before we said there was what? We said there was a stone. Okay, on a stone. When Solomon built the temple, he was aware that it would ultimately be destroyed. Therefore, he constructed a chamber in which the ark would be entombed below the temple building in a deep maze-like vaults. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying Solomon knows nothing stands forever, even his beautiful temple. Even his beautiful temple is not going to stand forever. It only stood 400 years, which is a nice amount of time, but it's not forever. So Maimonides says he built a place, a chamber within the Temple Mountain. Under the Temple Mountain, he built a place to hide, to a chamber to hide the ark. But it's deep under the mountain, and it's maze-like. In other words, it's hard to get to. King Yehoshua commanded that the ark be entombed in the chamber built by Solomon. As it is said, Chronicles 2, and he said to the Levites who would teach wisdom to all Israel, place the holy ark in the chamber built by Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. You will no longer carry it on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God. When it was entombed, Aaron's staff, the vial of manna, and the oil used for anointing were entombed with it. All these sacred articles did not return in the second temple. Okay, so in other words, you have King Yoshiyahu. You look at the footnote here, the last of Judah's righteous kings. He witnessed the spiritual decline of Jewish people and foresaw the inevitable destruction of the temple. So I believe Yoshiyahu lived about 100 years before the temple was destroyed, maybe a little bit more. But he realized where history is heading, and he realized that the people are becoming corrupt, and the temple was going to be destroyed because they're not heeding to the command, to the voice of the prophets. So Yoshiyahu tells the priests, according to Maimonides' reading of this verse, hide the ark, and therefore it didn't come back. There was no ark in the second temple. Where is the ark? According to this opinion, it's in a chamber, underground chamber in the Temple Mountain. So that's a nice piece of history. Okay, so that's a nice piece of history. That's a starting point of our discussion. In case you were looking for the Ark and you're looking around the world, let's save you money. You don't have to go anywhere. I give you the exact location. So what is the questions we're going to ask? Of course, we want to get to the deeper meaning. What is the significance of all of this? What's the significance to the fact that the Ark is still on the Temple Mountain? But the way to get to the explanation, we have to start with questions, because Jews are always asking questions. So the question that Rebbe asks on this section of Maimonides are as follows. First of all, Maimonides sets out in his introduction to his book of halacha, to the code of law, he says the purpose of this book is to teach law. You want philosophy? Buy my other book. Well, he doesn't say that, but that's the implication. And therefore, the book of Yad HaChazakah, the book of law in Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, is, I would say, 99.9% law. In a few places, he goes away from law and starts talking other areas, philosophy, history. But every time he does, the Rebbe says, 1 second, it can't just be philosophy per se, it can't just be history per se, it has to be philosophy or history that's relevant to the law, because that's what he said in the intro. In the introduction, he said, this is a book of law. So every matter has to be relevant to the law. So now the question is, what relevance is it to know that the Ark is in the Temple Mountain? It's a nice thing. If you're a historian, it's a very good thing to know. But what's the halacha? What's the law? What's the relevance to the law? That's the one question, especially that this matter is not 100% clear, because in the Talmud, there are two opinions. Some opinions believe that the Ark was taken to Babylonia when the temple was destroyed. So there's a disagreement in the Talmud. Now, Maimonides takes a side here. So if you say it's undisputed history, so okay, he's just telling you history, we can understand. We're still asking why he has to tell it. But again, he's saying he's just recording the historical record. But here he's not. But here he's taking a side, because there is a historical debate. And if he's taking a side, there must be a reason why he's taking a side, and there must be a reason relevant to halacha, relevant to the law, because otherwise it wouldn't be in this book. Okay, is that a troubling question? Is this enough to bother us? Enough to spend a couple of minutes? So let's first, before we go to the Rebbe's interpretation, we'll try to offer what other commentaries interpret, because we're going to have many layers in this interpretation. Maimonides has a very interesting theory. Maimonides' theory in law is that the Temple Mountain, the holiness of the Temple Mountain, exists till today. Not only that, but to the extent that he says, theoretically, a person can bring offerings in the temple, even if there is no temple. In other words, there's something about the Temple Mountain that's holy, even if the temple is not there. And therefore, like I said, he's in the minority opinion, but Maimonides says you're allowed to bring an offering in a temple, even if there's no temple. In other words, in the place of the altar. Now, we don't do it for technical reasons, but that's what Maimonides believed. And there's a whole history, I don't want to get into it right now, where the Rebbe said, right after the 6-day war, so why can't we bring offerings now? Because we're ritually impure. Why are we ritually impure? Because we're ritually impure. But the problem here is that there are certain offerings that override ritual impurity. For example, the Paschal offering. So the law of the Paschal offering is that most of the community are ritually impure, you can bring the Paschal offering. Okay, if there's a temple. But Maimonides says you have to bring the Paschal offering, you have to bring offerings, you're allowed to bring offerings if there is no temple. And we can't say we're not bringing offerings because we're ritually impure, because the Passover sacrifice overrides ritual impurity. Oh, so what do? Okay, so you're living in Greenwich, so you're lucky you don't have to bring the Pesach offering. If you go on vacation to Israel and you're living in Eilat, you also don't have to. And if you're living in Israel before 1967, you also don't have to, because the Jordanians are not going to let you come to the Western Wall, certainly not to the Temple Mountain. Problem was 1967, the Jewish people conquered the Temple Mountain. Came Passover in 1968. The Rebbe told his followers in Jerusalem, you have to move out of Jerusalem for the first day of Passover. Because if you're there, you may have to bring a Paschal sacrifice. Why? Because Maimonides says that you have to bring you're allowed to bring sacrifices even if there is no temple. But we're ritually impure. But regarding the Paschal sacrifice, it doesn't matter. So for a few years, every Passover, the Chabad Hasidim living in Jerusalem would pack their bags and move away from Jerusalem. If you're not there, you're distant, you're exempt. Until a few years later, the Rebbe said, no, you could stay. Why? Because the situation changed. Now, if we want to come onto Temple Mountain, the Arabs won't allow us to. And now we don't have the political possibility to. But after the 6-day war, you could do whatever you want. The Arabs were silent. There was a problem. If you're following Maimonides, you may have a problem if you're in Jerusalem. Why am I telling you this bit of history? Not to tell you that now today you could be in Jerusalem for the first days. That's not why I'm telling this to you. I'm telling this to you because Maimonides' philosophy has real ramifications in the real world, because he holds that the temple is holy, Temple Mountain is holy, even if there is no temple. So we know that about Maimonides. So now there's a fascinating commentator. They call him the Yavitz. That's his name. That's the name. That's the name of his book. It's the acronym of his name. They tell me that the Jacob Javits, who was a senator of New York, is his descendant. They used to have the Javits Center in Manhattan. I think it still exists. I don't know. Haven't been there many, many, many years. But in any case, so the Yavitz says like this. He says, why does Maimonides say the Temple Mountain is holy even if there is no temple? You know why he says that? Because he believes the Ark is still in the temple. So it's interconnected. So the fact that the Ark is in the temple, the Ark is in the Temple Mountain, is relevant to law. It's not just history, it's law. The fact that Maimonides believes that the Ark is hidden within the Temple Mountain is the rationale why Maimonides believes that today the Temple Mountain is holy. So our original question is, why does Maimonides talk about the history of the Ark and what happened to the Ark? Seemingly, Maimonides is not a book of history, it's the book of law. But we say, no, this tidbit of history is actually very relevant to the law. Because if he would believe the Ark is in Babylonia, or was taken to Babylonia and then lost since then that affects his opinion about the holiness of the Temple Mountain. But if Maimonides believes, as he follows the opinion of the Talmud, that there's almost like there's an underground structure, there's an underground chamber, and the Ark, which is the most holy article of the temple, is present there. Now we understand why he believes that the Temple Mountain is holy even after the temple is destroyed, to the extent why you're allowed to bring offerings even when there is no temple. Okay, so our question was, what does this bit of history have to do with the law? The answer is, it's very relevant to the law. Okay, so that's a wonderful answer. Not the problem with this answer. What the Rebbe says, it's a good answer. The problem with that answer is that it does not explain why Maimonides gives us all the details. Could have just said 3 words. Could have just said that the Ark was hidden in its place in the Temple Mountain. Is it important to know that when Solomon built the temple, he built an underground chamber? Is it important to know that the underground chamber is hidden in maze-like area? It's hard to get to. Is it important to know specifically which king was the king who said, Yoshiyahu was the one who said to put the Ark in the underground chamber? Is it important to know that, to quote the verse to prove that? Seemingly, that's all history, and that history is not relevant to the interpretation that Maimonides gets into the history, because he wants to talk about he wants to prove his point that the Temple Mountain is holy even today. If that's the case, he should just say, by the way, you know where the Ark is? The Ark was hidden in its place. You want to know the history? Go read the Bible, find the history. He's not a history book, but Maimonides quotes the history. Okay, so we want to expand that. We want to say that the details that Maimonides is saying is also relevant to a matter of law. Okay, so what do we have so far? We have the Maimonides, we have the question on Maimonides, we have the answer of the Yavitz, we have the Rebbe saying we want more. And now we're going to get into the more. Right? So far, so good. Everybody's clear. Right? I'm just going to put Maimonides on the screen again because why look at me if you can look at him. Right? So all this information, when Solomon built the temple, he was aware that it would ultimately be destroyed. He constructed a chamber in which the ark could be entombed below the temple building, in deep maze-like vaults. King Yoshio, these 3 paragraphs, we don't really need these 3 paragraphs. Just say the ark was hidden in its place. Okay, so the link, yes. Okay, so I share the link if you want to open up Maimonides. Okay, so what's the big idea? The big idea is like this. The law that Maimonides is teaching is to tell you as follows. The requirement of building the temple is to build a temple. And again, according to most opinions, the most important article within the temple was the ark, because the ark contained the 10 commandments and the tablets that Moshe gave us. So we build the most important place within the temple is the Holy of Holies. But the requirement to build the temple is to build the temple and the Holy of Holies, but to have a double chamber, to have a chamber that is above the ground and below the ground. And it's not history, it's law, because this is a requirement of the building of the temple. That's what Maimonides is teaching us. In other words, conventional wisdom is you build the temple, you build the temple. If the temple is destroyed, you have to store the ark somewhere, so you store it in the storage house. But that's not the same theme as the temple. What Maimonides is trying to allude to is that you have to build it. When Solomon built the temple, he built the temple with 2 floors. In other words, there really are 2 possible states, and both are included within the temple. There's above ground and there's below ground. And therefore Maimonides emphasizes that they didn't go looking for a place to hide the ark later, after they realized that it will be destroyed. But from the beginning, when Solomon built the temple, initially he built a place to put it underground. In other words, it's part of the building. It also explains why Maimonides tells you about King Yoshiyahu, that King Yoshiyahu built, actually was the one who put the ark underground, entombed it in the language of this translation. You see, Yoshiyahu lived many, many decades before the destruction. So seemingly he wouldn't have the authority or the law, the right to take the ark out of the temple. How would you take the ark out of the temple? It's like you're destroying the temple. Okay, you say, I'm afraid that in the future it would be taken away. Okay, so we'll bury it when the armies of the enemy show up, right? The siege against Jerusalem took many months. He could have waited until we would have plenty of time, decades later, to hide the ark. So what gives Yoshiyahu the authority to take the ark out of the Holy of Holies, where there's a commandment to build the Holy of Holies, build the temple, build the Holy of Holies, and place the ark within the Holy of Holies? So who gives him the right to take it out? So the answer is, he's not taking it out of the ark. I'm sorry, he's not taking the ark out of the temple. He's just moving it from one chamber of the temple to the other chamber of the temple. But the second chamber, the underground chamber, is actually also considered part of the temple. And therefore he has the choice. It's a choice. You're going to put it above ground or below ground. But even if it's below ground, it's still considered part of the temple and part of the mitzvah to build the temple. And that's why We're not going to go through every detail here that Rebbe points out, but that's why even when Maimonides quotes the fact that King Yoshiyahu commanded the ark to be entombed in the chamber built by Solomon, he emphasizes in the chamber built by Solomon, and he quotes the verse, and he said to the Levites who would teach wisdom to Israel, place the holy ark in the chamber built by Solomon, the son of King David, the son of David, king of Israel. We know Solomon is the son of David, king of Israel. We know all of this information. What is King Yoshiyahu highlighting? He's highlighting and saying this chamber that is underground is not a backup storage plan. It's not a storage. It's like if the temple is destroyed, we have to find somewhere else to build the temple. No, even when the temple stood, there are two possibilities. You can put the ark above ground or below ground. But even in the below ground chamber where it is till this day, that is considered part of the temple. And that's the law. The law is when you build a temple, you build two possibilities, above ground and below ground. Okay, so what are the spiritual ramifications of that? The spiritual ramifications of that idea is that, in a sense, the temple was never destroyed. The temple is never destroyed. And the second temple and the future third temple is not a new temple, it's a continuum of the first temple. Because the first temple always exists. So the temple was not destroyed. Now, of course, the temple was destroyed. That's a setback. But what we're going to look at it from the spiritual perspective and say, the setback is just an opportunity to actually rebuild the temple in a more glorious way. But the point here is that the temple was never destroyed. Even when it looks like a temple, we don't see the temple, we don't see the holiness of the temple. We don't see it above ground, but beneath ground, it is there and the same. And the setback is only temporary. And once the setback is over, the temple is rebuilt in a more glorious way, but it's not a new concept, it's a continuum of the old one. So it's really one temple that exists all the time. So what are some ramifications of this in the spiritual life of the Jew? So you could look at the temple. We always said that the temple exists in the life of every Jew. And there's the ark. Now, what we learned here is that there's an ark that's above ground and an ark that's below ground. What does it mean the ark is above ground and below ground? So the ark that's above ground, when the temple is built above the ground, it means we can sense and feel the holiness and positivity in our life, in our conscious mind, and in our feelings. So the temple is built and the temple stands. But then there are times where the temple is destroyed. In other words, our sense of connection to spirituality, our sense of a connection to the divine, we don't feel it. We don't feel connected. So the temple, we think the temple is destroyed. And what is the spiritual ramification of Maimonides' bit of history here? The temple was not destroyed. What happens is the temple now, the holiness moves from above the ground to below the ground, from the conscious mind to the subconscious mind. So of course, yes, we'd rather be able to see and sense the temple. But what we're saying here is, even if we don't see the temple, and even if we can sense the temple is still there. And it's still there, it's just concealed within our soul. But that concealment is actually a continuum of the built temple. And therefore, it's only temporary. And ultimately, the hidden temple will reemerge into our conscious mind. So in other words, what we're trying to say here is that there is no such thing within the Jewish soul that the temple and the ark, which represents the divine presence, there's no time when a person does not have a divine presence within himself. That's the conventional interpretation. Conventional interpretation is you have a time when the temple is built and you have a time when the temple is destroyed. What we're saying here is Solomon builds the temple, and therefore, and that's just a symbol of what's happening in our soul. Our spiritual temple, we also have two dimensions. We have the revealed temple and we have the underground temple, conscious and subconscious. And even when the conscious temple is destroyed, the subconscious temple is always there. And that is part and parcel of the building of a temple that was planned within the temple. And therefore, there is there is never a time where the divine presence is not within the Temple Mountain, and therefore, by extension, not within our own soul. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. It's a little shorter today, but I think that it's an important lesson how we view ourselves, we view somebody else. You can always sense with a person, every person is always a temple for God, is a house for holiness, a home for holiness. The only question is, where's the ark? Is the ark above the surface in the Temple Mountain, or is the ark hidden in maze-like hiding places? Sometimes it's very hard to get to. We have not got to it in 2,000 years. But the bottom line is it's still there. And that's a lesson for ourselves, how we view ourselves, how we view the other people, how we view destruction. Destruction just means that the revealed aspect of holiness is destroyed, but the essence in the concealed way, if we can tap into the concealment, it is certainly very much present and very much in existence. So that's the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining. And comments, questions are welcome. Otherwise, we'll see you in good health. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.